Welcome back to Emergency Capitalism. With me today, as always, is Fabio Vighi, and his book, Emergency Capitalism, is a must-read in this era of post-neoliberalism and the Trump trade war. So, Fabio, I wrote you and asked you to come back on. I've been meaning to do that for a while, but now it seems like an imperative. And, let me give you the background. You know, we have another author who we promote quite often on this channel named Chris Catrone. And before Trump got elected the second time, actually before Trump failed to get elected back in 2020, Catrone outraged me by saying, if Trump gets reelected, we're going to see a boom in the economy. And I was like, I don't understand why you would say that, because all the metrics, all the analysis I'm seeing from people like Michael Roberts, for instance, who is a marxist, indicates that we're still deeply in a long recession, that we are not going to be able to simply or easily overcome it with by tinkering. And now Chris is saying that Trump's tariffs and his attempts to restructure the global economy includes an effort to devalue capital in order to set up a boom, which he didn't say in 2020, but which seems to me to be true. So I'm wondering how you imagine things might proceed. Could this be another moment like what happened in the 80s, in the early 80s with Ronald Reagan, where he created a recession that then led to a boom, or the Volcker shock before that? How do you?
Yeah, well, first of all, we need to take this put it into the historical context that it deserves. You know, we're not in the 80s. We moved on. We've had, 30, 40 years of neoliberal financialization of the economy, and especially the relocation of production, mostly in China. Made in China has been dominant factor in terms of production of value also, right? The value chains, the global value chains. Globalization was essentially this, right? What we call globalization was essentially offshoring value production to China mostly, and I'm talking about American companies. I start from the 1978, more or less, the opening up of China to foreign capitals. So it's very difficult, I think, to go back to those days now. I think nearly impossible. So what I think about tariffs is that it's either a delusion of the largest magnitude you can think of, and maybe we got people who are sincerely deluded about the possibility of reshoring production to the United States to the extent that it can create another economic boom of sorts. I think those conditions are gone and they're not coming back. First thing, there could be, an element of delusion in that. I think it's desperate times. We are reaching desperate times, and therefore people sort of start doing desperate things. And I think tariffs might be part of this. But at the same time, I'm looking at what tariffs have done. We've had like a few months of tariffs declarations, right, from Liberation Day, etc. And if I'm looking at specifically trade with China, right, because obviously when you're talking about trade war, you're thinking mostly about, the trade with China. China producers, American consumers. That's been the sort of Pacific trade route since the beginning of globalization, essentially. And if you look at that, nothing has changed over the last 6 months. Still the same number of cargo ships are leaving Chinese ports to reach, West Coast ports, Los Angeles, etc., through the Pacific. The same percentage of goods are being traded. Nothing exactly is moving. So you ask yourself, is it really what this tariffs war, this trade war is about? Or is it just purely optics? Is it purely rhetoric? Right? Is it purely about creating conditions that might force the Federal Reserve or the People's Bank of China to stimulate the economy, to inject more money into the system, to do more monetary easing? Incidentally, the People's Bank of China last week has started doing precisely that, cutting interest rates on key financial indicators, repos, as well as other important rates for the economy. So in other words, it's already started this monetary easing. And I don't think I've heard anybody complaining about that, right? I don't think I've heard the Western press complaining about China's monetary policy. And I think ultimately what Trump wants, unless he's completely deluded, right, which he might be, if he thinks that production can make America great again, like by bringing back production to the United States. If he's not that completely deluded, then probably what he wants is to bring down, he's got one priority, one main concern. The main concern is bringing down yields on the US Treasuries. The US Treasuries are maturing this year. It's about 9.2 trillion US Treasuries that are due to mature by the end of 2025, with about 7 trillion due by the start of autumn 2025, right? And the current yield on most of those debts is very high, much higher than when those IOUs were actually sold on the bond market. They if the yields stay where they are, for example, I think today or recently the benchmark 10-year yield was about 4.4, around 4.4. The cost of repaying just the interest of that debt for the United States is going to be around $1 trillion, right? A huge cost. So just renegotiating the bonds, right? Just renegotiating the bond, just rolling over the debt is going to be massively expensive. So what I'm thinking about, tariffs and all this flip-flopping around tariffs, because there's also been a lot of flip-flopping, right? So big declarations to start with, then of course, softening of a lot of these tariffs, and now the 90-day pause. Probably, I think Bessent said that it would take 1, 2, 3 years maybe to reach some kind of real, to negotiate, especially the tariffs with China. So this is in many ways, for me at least, a red herring. We can think of it in economic financial terms only if we think that they might have a purpose in forcing the hand of the central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve, in lowering interest rates, which would, again, make the US debt more easily renegotiable and at the same time keep the financial sector, the financial bubble, we should say, propped up where it is now. So if anything, I think the focus of Trump is not so much the real economy, but the financial sector, fictitious capital in Marxist terms. Because insofar as that fictitious capital is really dependent on debt addiction, essentially, is addicted to credit. And that credit needs to be cheaper than it currently is in order to be sustainable in financial terms. So I see the tariffs as, again, a bit of scaremongering, which is ultimately, as soon as As soon as the declaration was made, of course, there was a lot of talks about potential financial crash and potential repercussions. But as soon as those tariffs, talks about tariffs were softened a little, things went back to normal, and all of a sudden, financial markets sort of went up and up and up again, and stayed up, was where they are today, essentially, right? So I think I connect that if it's not completely diluted, as I said, so it could be just a case of political delusion, and the belief that politics today, capitalist politics, can act as more than just crisis management. Right, I think it's purely crisis management. It cannot. That's what it can do in a capitalist context as ours today, trying to manage the crisis of capital in whichever way possible, doing whatever it takes. That's what politics can do. I don't think there's more to that. I don't think there's anything emancipatory about tariffs in today's context. I don't think they are even realistic, to be honest.
Okay,
they were implemented. I mean, that's my initial take on it. But I'm
okay. Well, yeah. Let me just ask a couple of questions. Yeah. So the first thing I wonder is just about lowering interest rates in managing the debt.
Yeah.
Would inflation be another approach?
I think the way that they're going to try to, in essentially a recession, like an explicit recession, officially declared, would force the central bank to stimulate the economy by lowering interest rates. It's I think the main possibility that maybe even on the back of those tariffs, on the back of the sort of the scare tactics of those embodied one way or another by those tariffs, that you get an explicit sort of recession in the United States, a technical recession, even a quick one. So 2 quarters of contraction, to force the hand of the Fed to lower interest rates. Now, we know that the Fed can do it in the summer. It can also do it later on in the autumn. It's got many opportunities to lower interest rates. And I think when the economy sort of contracts steadily, then that's the opportunity to lower interest rates. And that would have a kind of beneficial effect on the yield as well. The yields would also potentially, almost surely lower, because that's how they're traded, right? When there's a loose monetary policy, the cost of those bonds tends to come down, whilst the price of those bonds goes up. And I think that's the objective, right? That's the sort of strategic objective behind all this. The priority is the debt market. I think we need to understand that, especially for the United States today. The debt market, which is, the treasuries are increasingly unloved by foreign investors. We know that, the Chinese, the Japanese. So there has to be buyers of those certificate of debt securities, for the yields to be kept low. Without any buyers, the yields go up, meaning that repaying those yields, even repaying those bonds, even renegotiating them, is increasingly difficult for the United States. And I think we are at a specific moment in history where that is the priority, because of the level of indebtedness of the U.S. economy now. All the talk about the debt ceiling as well, right? Anyway, we'll talk about that later.
Let me clarify my question. When I was a kid, my best friend's father was a political science professor at the Colorado College, which was down the road. And I used to get in debates with him about politics all the time. but I'm not really remembering any of the political debates right at this moment. I'm remembering a lesson he taught me.
Yeah.
I borrowed $10 from his son. I think I was about 12. And then my friend was like, when are you going to pay me back? It was like a week went by, and I was like, oh, well, he said, well, I know you got your allowance. When are you going to pay me that $10? And it may have been less than that, like $5 or something. And I said, oh, let me see if I can get it. Hold on. And then I went ahead and I got him the $5 and paid him back. And my friend's father noted my hesitancy to actually fulfill my obligation there and pay my friend back.
Yeah.
And he said that he understood why I would want to delay. He said, I know you're good to your word and you would, of course, eventually pay, but I can see why you wanted to wait, because the longer you wait, the less value is in the money you pay back as compared to the money you borrowed. Due to inflation.
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering, just on that basis, if simply increasing inflation might help lower the obligation of I'm very simple,
that's
grade
absolutely
school
true.
level. Yeah.
Inflating your way out of debt. That's known as inflating your way out of debt. So the less value the currency has, the less debt you have, essentially, right? So it's inflation is good for the debtor, not for the creditor. So again, all the talk about inflation could also, we know that inflation figures are manipulated. That's a fact now. They are calculated. CPI is calculated according to measurements that they don't reflect the way in which, for example, the same inflation was calculated in the 80s. So they tell you one thing, but inflation is much higher.
Right.
Essentially, right? It's not what they tell you it is. It's much higher. And we see it, the cost of living, as we call it. I think it's tangible. So inflation is certainly useful. Controlled inflation is certainly useful to the system because it inflates parts of the debt away. So that's certainly useful. And that could be parts of the equation. But I think for the time being, if there's a certain urgency, and I think there is, about cutting the interest rate, the cost of money, and therefore the debt yield, I think a recession, even a deflationary recession, would be useful, because you would force the hand. It would provide a justification that anybody could see and appreciate, and a justification for the Federal Reserve to cut rates. At the moment, they are 4.25, in the range of, I think, 4.25, 4.50. I think cutting them because of a contraction or a recession then would really improve the outlook of the U.S. debt. And I think it will have to come to that.
So basically, I wasn't allowed to wait long enough to really avoid my debt with my friend, and the United States isn't going to be able to put off this either. So that inflation is not
well, inflation is happening anyway, one way or another. Money is being devalued. When you talked about earlier, a kind of devaluation, blah, blah, blah. This is already happening. Maybe in 30, 50 years' time, the dollar will be worth zero.
Well, that'd be bad news, right?
No, you don't want that. That's not going to help any economic growth,
Yeah, right.
I think that's going to help the intervention of a new monetary system, and people are talking about it, with bitcoins, etc., and central bank digital currencies. I think at some point down the line, this will happen, because the trajectory is very clear. Fiat currency is losing value all the time. But again, it's something that politicians don't necessarily see. I don't think they reflect on this. They think that they can influence economic laws, whilst in fact it's the very objectivity of economic laws that ultimately forces them to take any crisis management decisions. So I think that Trump is actually working, very close with even with the Fed, despite the fact that there is some conflict, appears to be some conflict, with Powell. I think he's working very close with the financial elites. I think, despite the fact that he's saying he's a man of the people and he wants to bring back production to the United States to make, I think is ultimately focused on saving the part of the economy, in other words, the financial sector, which guarantees the United States the role that it has in the world today, that it continues to have in the world today. I mean, that's my perception of it.
You and most people I talk to are very convinced that the idea of onshoring as a solution for the long-term instability of the United States economy and by extension, I think the world economy, that is a pipe dream, that is a delusion. But I'm not quite as convinced. I mean, I do think that it's in the long term, like in 30, 40 years, if we were to see the kind of recovery that Reagan was able to produce back in the 80s. I know it's not the 80s, but if we were to see it, it would be, I think, similar to what Reagan actually produced, which was a recovery which actually set up the terms for the next crisis.
But it was mostly a recovery that was enabled by the financialization of the economy. This is exactly what the time when we had all these new financial instruments coming into the financial system, derivatives, in fact, from the 70s even, derivatives and securitization and blah, blah, blah. This all allowed that recovery, which was based essentially on the financialization of the economy, whilst production, so value production, the productive sector, was being exported, as it were, to Asian countries, mostly China. And the same for Western Europe, the same for England, the same for the UK, the same for Europe more generally. Already in the 80s, mid-80s, 90s, most of our economy in the West was essentially, linked to not so much to the productive sector, but to the tertiary sector, to the services sector. Already like 80%, 70% of the UK economy, for example, was already services based in the mid-1980s. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, production was already gone. And this is not because of a political decision. We need to keep that in mind too. It's not just a political decision. It's not just a political subjectivity that determines this. This is the objective laws. Capital goes where it can exploit cheap labor. Super cheap labor, and the Chinese labor at the time was incredibly cheap. I mean, immensely cheaper than any labor that could be found in the West.
Yeah, and, just to be clear, the reason that this happened, the reason for financialization, the reason it becomes necessary is not because of a decline in the production of actually useful things, right?
No. Useful things still kept being produced somewhere else.
Not only that, but you can continue to produce a ton of actual commodities in a country that's highly financialized due to automation.
Yeah.
And so we still have in the United States a very large manufacturing base, but it's highly automated. And
that's the other problem, right?
Yeah.
How do you create an economic miracle out of automation? I mean, if value production.
Let me just get to the end of my thought. So now what's happened is that as China has come up as a major manufacturer, with the United States running in second place, they have scaled up their productive capacity and automated to a large degree as well. They perhaps a bit less than the United States has, and their products that they produce are different. So they're more likely to produce products that are then used in another part of manufacturing down the line, whereas the United States produces what are called high value products. So emphasizing intellectual property more, actually, in order to, which is basically a form of rent seeking the final products out of the United States. But in any case, the point is that China is not escaping the same dynamic that set up the
No.
need for financialization in the United States. If there were to be a reconfiguration of where productivity would sit in the world system, in other words, if the United States were to take up more of manufacturing, it would do so on the basis of having a very automated, high-tech manufacturing base. And while it might shift some of the domestic economy from the service sector into production, it would not mean that the level of service sector work would decline to nothing, or even be it might still be like a 50-50 split or something like that in the US economy, because again, there would just not be as much of a need for a huge labor force in manufacturing in order to produce the goods that would actually meet the demand of the world, right? So we still have a problem of generating surplus value. Wherever productivity sits in the world, there's going to be that problem. But my understanding of how economic booms are created is that even with that being the case, if you can lower the cost of fixed capital through devaluation, you can set up the terms for profit making and generating a surplus in relation by you can cheapen wages, you can cheapen the raw materials, and you can also cheapen the initial investment, which would then, and if you can cheapen the initial investment, then you can set up terms for another round of accumulation, even if it does create the same drive towards eventual financialization and crisis. Does that make sense?
Kind of makes sense in abstract terms, but I think we tend to forget that really what we call capitalism, again, it's about a definition of what capitalism is once more, right? Historically, as a historically delimited society, as a historically delimited mode of production that creates socialization. Well, capitalism, in order to create socialization and to create growth in social terms, needs to employ a specific commodity, one specific commodity, which is labor, but mass labor, right? It needs mass productive labor to create growth organically from the economy itself. When it stops doing that, because of automation, essentially, I mean, that's already third industrial revolution in the 1970s, then we have a problem with capital reaching the internal limit of its own valorization potential. Valorization means putting labor to work, to produce commodities that then the laborers, the workers, essentially consume themselves,
okay.
right?
So let me just ask one clarifying question. Would you say that the service sector produces commodities that embody the value of labor?
There's many ongoing discussions about that. I mean, it depends what we mean by service sector. Some of it is totally unproductive. Some of it is somewhat related to the production of
like a tanning salon,
volume.
or a tanning salon, or a barber shop, or a dog walking service.
Unproductive. I mean, this is considered unproductive labor. You still have to pay for it. You still, it's wage labor, obviously, but it's not. It doesn't create organic conditions for organic growth because it's not directly connected with the production of commodities, right? Which is what capitalism is. You need somehow to be connected with the production of a commodity. If you are directly connected with the production of commodity, then we are really talking about productive labor. But those conditions have evaporated a long time ago, and this is what people struggle to understand when they talk about growth. Growth today can only be the kind of compensatory growth that we've had, yes, since the 90s or even 80s, with the financialization of the economy, with capital moving from investment in labor to capital huge capitals invested in stocks, right? In something completely different to labor. So it's money making money without labor, money creating more money without the commodity that in capitalist terms create value, which is labor.
When I read Capital Volume 1, there were tangible and intangible commodities, and like an intangible commodity might be like a bus driver would produce the commodity of travel, moving you from one place to another. He wouldn't have to be moving widgets. He could just move people from one restaurant to another, or from their homes to a restaurant, and that driving of people around is itself a commodity. I think the same would apply to a haircut, that is a commodity. And so it does seem to me that
there's a discussion around that, but I don't think we can. I mean, why do you think there's been such a huge, for example, why do you think the debts of advanced economies have gone through the roof so wildly over the last 25 years or even earlier? If the money could be found, the value could be found in the real economy itself. So if there was some kind of organic, reproduction of economic conditions from within the labor society, why all of a sudden central banks had to create trillions out of thin air, out of economic nothingness, to allow societies to reproduce themselves, if not because there was precisely because capitalism had reached an internal limit of reproduction, which doesn't mean that in a sense you can even start arguing whether we are still within capitalism today or we are already going in the kind of post-capitalist phase, because now the central aspect of what we call capitalism is no longer the productive economy. It's something else. It's
when it comes to haircuts, why have they? Why aren't haircuts enough to replace the value that would have normally been extracted from all sectors of the economy? Because I'm just assuming there's a declining rate of profit. In other words, that the surplus is generated is only overcoming the initial investment of labor to a lesser and lesser degree, right? And that the profit or the surplus available for reinvestment is declining, and so that would include in the service sector. But if the other sectors are declining at a faster rate, then it will do damage to the service sector, because those things are, as far as use values go, aren't as necessary. People will make cuts. They'll get haircuts left often, or they'll get one of those vacuum clipper thing where you can just run it over your own head and cut your own hair. And so and also as the tools for various service jobs cheapen, I think it becomes easier for people to avoid having to go to the market to meet their wants. So you can, like I said, buy that automatic hair clipper device. So I'm not saying that the service sector could simply grow and be so productive that it could overcome the tendency for the rate of profit to decline. I would imagine in some way or another it would apply there as well. But I'm just saying that it's not as though manufacturing alone is the only way to produce value in a capitalist society.
It's the main way to produce value, right? And I think when mass labor is laid off via automation, especially with artificial intelligence now, we probably have bus drivers. We don't need bus drivers any longer either. Most jobs are going, even in the services sector. I mean, we're all replaceable. I'm replaceable as a teacher, as a lecturer. The destroying the sector here because of debt, because the university is in so much debt that it needs to cut. And probably I will be replaced by some sort of machine at some point. Even so, there's very, very few sectors of the economy where the human element, human labor, is irreplaceable. Very few, and technology will get rid of most of us. So, in capitalist terms, this is a disaster. It's For me, it's wonderful that if technology can do most of the jobs, you know, it's a blessing. It's not a disaster. But for capitalism, it's a disaster because it means that less and less value is extracted out of human labor, and we know that that's the formula. That's the formula that guarantees capitalist growth. When you take that away, you end up with crisis management. You end up with a debt-based economy. You end up with managing debt the way we're seeing debt is being managed today via what I call emergencies, or even the threat of an emergency, even the threat of tariffs with those percentages, are enough to mobilize central banks as probably the most powerful institutions in the world today, to lower interest rates and to inject more fake fiat currencies, fake cash into the system. Fake insofar as it doesn't carry any value, it doesn't carry any labor. It's simply created out of thin air. Mouse-clicked money, which ultimately devalues money. Of course it does. It debases currencies, and I think the system is doomed in that respect, right? It is this. I mean, you can't. I don't want to be, pessimistic about it, because ultimately I'd like to see this system to end. So but at the same time, one needs another system to replace it, and another system that changes the elementary categories at play here.
Mm-hmm.
And at the moment, we can't see it. We don't have it. That's why we hang on so desperately to what we have. But what we have, the categories, labor, capital itself, currencies as they are today, fiat currencies, they are vanishing. And I think very quickly. We just tend not to see it, because sometimes it's something that the magnitude of which is very difficult to fathom, I think. But we need to make an effort and try to see that, because only that way, I think, can we begin to envisage a new system, really, where labor has a different purpose, where maybe money has a different purpose, which is not just that of self-augmentation, which is what capital is. That's the fundamental purpose of money, and so on. But first, you need to grasp that the system is really struggling to reproduce itself now, and it does it through, I think, by creating forms of barbarism, I think, which are more and more obvious, right? Wars, rearmament. Why all of a sudden this urge, right, to rearm in Europe, in Germany? I mean, in Germany, they've decided to make more debt, much more debt. They were always very frugal. They destroyed Greece because of its debt. But now they are indebting themselves also. They're adopting effectively the American model. More debt, more deficit spending. Trump is doing the same, by the way. More deficit spending for weapons, for arms. Maybe that's the productive side of the economy that he sees: weapons. That the United States still have, because they're selling weapons to Europe, they're selling weapons to the Saudis today. Qatar, they're getting some gifts back from Qatar, right? So to me, it seems like there really isn't any realistic possibility of another golden age, as we talked about before, another economic miracle, or even growth in real terms. It will be only growth for the uber rich, not for the rest. The rest are destined to become poorer and poorer, I'm afraid. I mean, this is really what the system has in store for us. More impoverishment. Obviously, it's the boiled frog syndrome, right? We don't realize, but that we're getting poorer and poorer every day. That our purchasing power is disappearing, etc., etc. But I think there's no way that this situation can be, amended in any way. It's kind of inevitable, and what we're seeing is just more and more desperate attempts at crisis management, really.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree on the foundational claim here, because I think capitalism itself is a crisis, right? And has been, since the Industrial Revolution began. It's been a perpetual crisis. Um, but go ahead.
But one thing is creative destruction, the famous idea of a creative destruction. You're in a crisis, but that crisis creates conditions to overcome the crisis itself and to kind of reproduce the system at a higher level of technological development. Now we are beyond that. There's no creative destruction anymore. The creative part is gone. There's only destruction. And destruction takes the form also of mass impoverishment. I don't see any potential for creative destruction any longer, because the destruction of one level of technological, one technology can be substituted by another more advanced technology, but only to the detriment of the system itself, because it eliminates more and more that commodity, which is labor, which creates value for the system. So the imbalance created by any kind of creative destruction today is just something which is unsustainable and ultimately destroys the system itself. So I think we are in that phase where we see a lot of morbid symptoms of this kind of final terminal crisis manifesting. And so I know that there's a lot of noise about Trump, and a lot of people seem to think that he's kind of carrying some sort of potential for, whether it's for the United States or for, I mean, it's also interesting how, the foreign policy of the United States up until recently was driven by this kind of progressive universalism, right? Progressive universalism. We are here for everybody. Our values are universal values that, this goes together with this idea of policeman of the world, etc., etc. And now we see this retreat into kind of nationalism, right? Make America great again. It's about the states. Tariffs go in this direction, right? Let's bring production back and let's make our economy better. Right? And I think Trump is the perfect actor for that.
I don't know. I mean, I see it as more complicated than that, because on the one hand, there is a drive to make America great again, but I'm not so sure it's nationalist, because, just ask a Canadian how they feel, about
I see.
Or German, because the United States is saying what Trump had said, or what JD Vance has said, is American values should be universal values. The people before me didn't have them. And let you guys in Europe, even set up you guys in Europe to violate the terms of the American experiment. We're back and we're telling you no. You have to be actual liberals. You have to be actual Democrats. That's what they're saying on the one hand. And on the other hand, they're saying shit like, maybe we don't need habeas corpus in the United States. And, and maybe we should deport people based on the content of their speech rather than any other basis, and so on.
It's interesting how the kind of an ideological level, the reasoning for these tariffs, I think, on Trump's part was always, I mean, it seemed to me, at least from my angle here, from my part of the world, that he was saying things like, "Oh, you've been exploiting us for too long," to Europe, right, or to others like China. You've taken too much from us. Now we have to take it back, right? Which again is kind of absurd, because
he's been saying that since the 80s, though. He's been unhappy with the trade deals with the rest of the world since the 80s, and he joined with Ross Perot in the early 90s to combat NAFTA and GATT. He was unhappy with the neoliberalism of those
with kind of globalization, right? But globalization, I mean, Americans were major beneficiaries, still are major beneficiaries of that globalization, right? I mean, production is in China, surplus are invested into into American stock markets, Wall Street booms, and on top of that, U.S. consumers, which again, internal consumers are 70% of U.S. GDP, so that's quite important, can consume cheap products from China. So, I mean, those trade agreements actually were quite beneficial to the U.S. overall.
But the argument has been from the anti-globalization, and I don't like the term anti-globalization and haven't since 1999, because it's a different, another world is possible, another globalization is possible. It's always the statement. But the argument has always been, especially on the left until recently, all these cheap goods from China, they undermine, not only do they undermine local, businesses, but also American workers, and people should be willing to pay a little bit more for a higher quality product that will last. And in another part of the trade, the benefit for that will be you'll get to have a good job that will pay you more. That's been
right.
what people on even the progressive side, the kind of Bernie Sanders side of the Democratic Party argued, and since '99 or earlier on, and Ross Perot said something similar. He said this is screwing over the American worker. It's screwing over American industry. It's
Of course it is. I mean, it is. It is in real terms. It actually is, but it's not a political decision. It's capital goes where it finds better conditions to make profits, essentially, right? To augment itself, to expand itself. So
no, I agree. Yeah.
I mean, the 1970s, the stagflation of the 1970s forced capitals to invest in China where labor was so cheap. And you can argue that the US as a whole benefited from it, for that kind of exploitation, even, you could call it. Extraction of surplus value, like the rate of surplus value was actually going up. So, it's okay. It's nice to say, but at the same time, you've got to realize that it's not just a political decision. It's a systemic decision. There are systemic forces in play that are much stronger than any political decision. I think we're investing too much hope in our politicians here. I repeat that. I think they're just managing. All they can do is manage the crisis that we're in at the moment. The crisis is much bigger than them, and their capacity to comprehend it, most of them, unfortunately. So, all they can do is actually try, despite all the declaration. A lot of them are ideological. I'm absolutely certain.
They're all ideological.
But a lot of Trump is ideological. He's selling you, like in the classical sense of ideology. They're selling you a narrative.
Yeah. No,
I
don't
disagree. So you vote for them and blah blah blah. But it doesn't really care.
I want to point out I didn't vote for Trump.
Good.
But
Good man.
I'm not.
I know you haven't.
No, this is not a pro-Trump.
But it's not a matter of voting. Even it's not Biden probably would that even worse. I'm not saying that he would have done better. It's not a matter of political choice. It's just that politics can only go so far. Within the current crisis regime that we're in.
I think that what you just said is a great place to stop the first half. Do you have time for maybe half an hour more?
Yeah. Let's have another half hour. Yeah.